Yeah, exactly. I think it's a process rather than just a sort of a sudden moment. And I think in hindsight, really this tracks back to 2011, 2012, because that was the time when there were these massive protests in Russia, primarily in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the largest we'd seen since the end of the Soviet Union. And this was, genuine protest, largely from the rising middle class, against Putin returning to the presidency, against rigged elections, against that just that sense that they weren't being listened to. But Putin was not willing to believe that this was actually a natural and organic response from the Russian people. He saw the hand of the CIA, the State Department, and indeed MI6 behind it. And so, from his point of view, this was a sign that the West was coming for him now. That, just as they'd been behind all the various Arab Spring risings and the colored revolutions in the post Soviet states, this was just them. So, really, from that point, we have seen a sort of a steady trajectory. 2014, the response to the annexation of Crimea, again, it angered him. Then, when later on, obviously, we have the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, once again, Putin did not see that as being something that was natural to the Ukrainian people. He saw this as a Western plot to basically steal Ukraine from Russia's sphere of influence. So bit by bit. And then I think last year, I think it was just that sense of he gave up on any last hope that he can reach some kind of a positive deal with the West. And so he thought, no, the West is an enemy. And more to the point, the West needs to feel that it is at war with us. It doesn't get to just simply allow the Ukrainians to go and do all the hard fighting and so forth and sit back in their comfort. The West must made to be feel uncomfortable.
I know it's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible to know what's going on inside his head. I mean, do you think that he actually truly believes this, or he uses it as a vehicle and a pretext for what he is actually doing in terms of the aggression against Ukraine?
I mean, I think he actually does believe it. As you say, it's impossible to know. But nonetheless, it's been a pretty consistent theme throughout his various statements, even before 2022. And of course, he also uses this. It's a great pretext. And authoritarian regimes often like wars because they allow you to basically say that there is now no room for loyal opposition. You're either a patriot, which means you do as you're told, or you're a traitor, which means anything the state does to you, is right and proper. So, I mean, yes, there is, of course, a political value. And yes, of course, it's being used to try and mobilize Russians. Remember, still to a large extent, Russian forces are being manned by volunteers, even if in most cases they're volunteers drawn to it by the money that is being offered rather than any great patriotic mission. But when it comes down to it, I don't think this is just some total political artifice. I think the trouble is he and the people around him in this coterie of rather paranoid ex-KGB types, all products of the Soviet order who haven't really been able to cope with the collapse of Soviet imperial status. I think that is the way they've coped. They decided that somehow this was done to them by a conspiratorial West.
Your latest report, Gangsters at War, explores how the Kremlin is now using Russian-based organized crime and criminals as proxies, as a form of statecraft. Who are these criminals serving the Kremlin? How has their role actually evolved?
Well, in terms of who they are, the interesting thing is, if we take the Leighton attacks, for example, these were not Russians. These were not people who had any Russian connection. The problem is precisely that actually the Russian state is not just using Russian-based criminal organizations, which have all kinds of contacts all across Europe and beyond, because for years they had emerged in some ways as the kind of one-stop shop cash and carry for the local gangs. You wanted heroin, the Russians could get it for you. You want guns, you want cyber services, whatever the Russians could provide. So they weren't necessarily carrying out crime on the streets. They were the sort of service providers to those who were carrying out the crime. So they have all sorts of contacts. But also nowadays, a lot of these kind of low-level gangsters who are employed to burn something down here or daub some graffiti there, they're recruited on the internet, on social media or on the deep web or whatever, which means often they don't even know they're doing Putin's dirty work. But the point is why they're being used. Look, the Kremlin has a long pedigree of close relations with organized crime and of being able to sometimes use them to its own purposes. But in some ways, we are actually caught by the unintended consequences of our own actions. We kicked out 750 diplomats across the West, Russian diplomats, as part of a purge on spies who were operating under diplomatic cover. And that didn't absolutely have an important impact in really curbing Russia's espionage networks. The thing is, though, I think in hindsight, we didn't really think the next step. How would a bunch of, frankly, emotionally bankrupt, but often smart and imaginative individuals on the other side, how would they react? They weren't going to just simply throw up their hands and say, oh, well, we had a good run, we can't do much more spying. No, of course not. They were going to look to, well, who else can we use? And so they've turned to all sorts of different proxies, not just criminals, but also, for example, people who have an ideological support for Russia, people who are just simply unhappy with the status quo in the West, people who are just simply, able to be hired for, often what is relatively small amounts of money. So they've been building up these networks of proxies to fill the gap left by our sort of expulsions. And we're really, we are aware of it. Something that Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, noted, but we're catching up rather than actually having been ahead of the game.
So, do you think that those expulsions were a mistake then? And if they were, what would have been the alternative to that?
No, the expulsions were absolutely right. But when we did that, we should have realized that the Russians were not going to stand still. We should have, at that time, also been thinking, look, we need to be ready for the next wave, rather than then. Look, there were people within the British and other security services who did have an idea. But I think that we should have been more prepared for this increased reliance on proxies.
And how much control does Putin himself have over these proxies, these criminal proxies?
It's very transactional. And look, Putin himself doesn't get involved. He is way too sort of stratospherically high. He sets broad objectives, and then various minions and subject agencies all seek to try and satisfy the Tsar, often competitively still. So you might have different intelligence agencies trying different things to the same end. And how much control do they have? Look, this is a very transactional process. This is essentially reaching out and, if we can use this kind of language, outsourcing certain activities. And what they do is sometimes they offer the carrot. For example, we do know that those Russian gangs still involved in smuggling everything from heroin and guns to counterfeit goods and untaxed cigarettes out of Russia basically get a free pass through Russian airports and ports if they're also bringing back sanctioned smuggled goods that the state wants, say, microchips or whatever else. Other times, though, it's more the stick. We know what you're doing. We'd like you to do something because you're good patriotic Russians, aren't you? With the clear implication that if you don't, you're not patriots and you can expect more pressure from the state. So, it is still very much a kind of bit by bit use of criminals when they seem to have particular access. Of course, the longer this goes on, the more institutionalized these connections become. And one of the big nightmare scenarios for the future is Russia ends up a bit like North Korea. North Korea has this thing called Bureau 39, which is basically the sort of state's ministry of organized crime. And we might end up seeing the Russians become much, much more focused and institutionalized in how they use gangsters.
Just really interested on that point to ask you what effect you think the deepening alliance between Pyongyang and Moscow is likely to have beyond the battlefields of Ukraine.
Yeah, on the one hand, this is obviously a kind of an alliance of pariahs. Neither necessarily trusts or like the other, but basically the North Koreans have ammunition and troops, the Russians have food and fuel and technology that the North Koreans want. Of course, the more this goes on, I think there's several impacts. One is they do learn from each other, and as I say, I think the Russians will learn lessons from Pyongyang about actually how you run transnational criminal structures, even while actually being under very, very tight sanctions in theory. Secondly, it encourages this idea of a kind of, I don't want to make it sound like an axis of anti-Westernism or whatever, because that makes it sound a lot too united. But nonetheless, we are seeing a cohering around Russia a whole variety of countries that are unhappy with what they see as a Western-dominated status quo, and in a way are creating an alternative world order. And the final element is the big wild card is China. Now, there's no way that Pyongyang would be sending troops as well as ammunition to Russia without Beijing's approval. because in part, Beijing's nightmare is that the North Korean system and economy collapses, and suddenly it has 50 million refugees on its border. But as this alliance becomes tighter and tighter, will Beijing bless that, or will it begin to become rather uncomfortable and actually want to try and sort of separate that? And that in turn may create new tensions between Moscow and Beijing.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.